In this video, I'm going to show you how to play the perfect game. It's played in round 1 of the American Cup by tournament top seed Fabiano Caruana, playing with the white pieces against Grigoriy Oparin. It's a very prestigious event, the American Cup. It's taking place from March 12 till 21. Some of the best players in the US are competing for $75,000. It's a top prize. And well, Fabiano Caruana sees this event as the warming up for the candidates tournament, which is taking place in a few weeks time from now. But he's playing against a very strong grandmaster. But what happens is almost close to perfection. Let's see what happens in the game. And of course, in the next couple of days, I will keep you posted, of course, on more exciting games which are about to be played in this event. Well, Fabiano starts his tournament with a move 1d4. And after d5, c4, e6, knight c3, we have the queen's gambit declined. And Oparin plays here the move a6, which may look a very strange move, but the idea is to take on c4, following it up by the move b5. In that case, you are just a pawn up. So the principal move here is to take on d5, and after e takes d5, knight f3. Well, we have a typical, very popular line from the Queen's Gambit declined. It's called the Janowski variation, and it has been played by many strong players. After knight f6, bishop g5, white is putting pressure on this knight on f6, so black brings out the bishop to e6 to defend the pawn on d5 one more time. And after e3, knight bd7, white plays here the move h3, kind of a useful move, as you will prevent black from ever getting a bishop to g4 later on. And after bishop d6, bishop to d3, black played the move c6. Now, very interesting moment, especially when you're not familiar with these structures. Here the move bishop f4 is a very interesting idea, as white is, of course, offering the exchange of bishops, hits the unprotected bishop on d6, and obviously black can take on f4, doubling the pawns on the f-file, but this is actually quite a favorable structure for white, having various ideas, including just to trap the bishop on e6 with the move f5. So that is the main idea behind white's setup. Anyway, black didn't take this bishop on f4, played instead a move queen c7, so the dark squared bishops are getting exchanged. And well, after castling kingside by both sides, here we have a very interesting situation. It's a relatively calm position, typical for the Queen's Gambit. I mean, white has an extra pawn in the center, black has one extra pawn on the c-file. And normally you would expect ideas like a3 and b4 trying to launch some sort of queenside expansion. But that's not what Fabiano did in this game. And we can assume that Fabiano has studied this position very well, as he in fact played it twice against Magnus Carlsen. So that's very interesting. In the previous games, Magnus Carlsen playing with the white pieces, he played both the moves queen b3 and also the move queen c2. But Fabiano instead decides to play here the move a4, which is a totally different idea. His plan is to play the move a5 and to fix the pawn structure on the queen side, and maybe later try to get a knight to a4 and maybe prepare the knight to come into c5 at the right moment. So that's a very interesting idea. But black plays here the move a5, and you're wondering, why did white exactly go for this setup? Because black is now having a nice control on the b4 square, and white is unable to expand on this side of the board. Well, Fabiano's idea will be revealed very soon. He played the move queen b3, and although the pawn on b7 is under attack, you're not really going to take, because after g6 by Oparin, if you do take the pawn on b7, there's rook fb8 and the queen is just trapped. So the pawn is not really the main idea here. Well, white played the move knight to g5. That's an interesting move, because what is this knight going to do? Well, one of the main ideas is to prepare the f-pawn to come forward. And if you want, at some point, you can even consider the trade of knight for the bishop. Well, let's see how it works out. Rook fe8 was played, and now rook ae1. So white is no longer interested in building up the tension on the queen side. He is centralizing its rooks and is looking for a way to break through via the center. Black has different ways of playing, but the bishop on e6, even though it's standing there, it looks like very solid. It's quite passive piece, and in general black is not able to do that much. Here, as black, I think something like knight h5 with the idea to get a knight over to g7 and prepare bishop f5, that's something which could be considered, because in general white's bishop is much better than the bishop on e6, so trading off light squared bishops would help black. But anyway, this didn't happen. Black played knight to f8. White played here the move queen c2, so the queen comes back to c2. It's now forming a nice battery with the bishop. And what you also have to realize is that black is never really able to generate any active piece play with a pawn break. Let's say if you do play c5, it's really bad. There will follow knight b5, and thanks to the insertion of the moves a4 and a5, this square is really weak. White is hitting the queen, and on the next move the pawn on c5 can just be taken. So instead of c5, black went here for the move knight h5, preparing to get a knight back via g7, preparing also to get the bishop to f5, or even play a move like f6. Well, here white played the move f4. Now you understand why the move rook a e1 is played, so the other rook is doing pretty well, supporting the advance of the f pawn. Black played the move f6, questioning the knight on g5, and white decided to trade off that knight for that bad bishop. And this is a very interesting decision, because black has 3 possible recaptures. Either the queen, the rook, or the knight. They all can take back the knight on e6. But it's a very important moment. It's the critical moment of the game already, in fact, as whatever you're going to play, white will follow up with the move f5. Now, if you do play queen takes e6, f5, you're attacking the queen, you're attacking the pawn, and the king side will be open, so that will help the white pieces to launch an attack against the king. Also, after rook takes e6, which was played in the game, the move f5 is really strong. But I will show you the best move for black. It's to take back with the knight on e6. So if you do give black one more move, f5 is going to be played, and the position is quite blocked. The knight can come back to f6, maybe it will come to e4. Anyway, the critical line is f5 here to attack the knight on e6. You're attacking the pawn on g6, and now you're not going to take on f5, but instead knight g5 is a very cool move. You're sacrificing the pawn on g6, and this requires very deep calculation by both players, because now it looks as if black's king side is just falling apart. However, thanks to the move knight takes h3, black is able to maintain the balance. After taking the knight, the queen comes into g3 with check. Now you can block with your queen, and it looks like black's attack is over. But after rook takes e3, all of a sudden there is quite a bit of pressure on white's king side, because trading of queens is not an option here. There is rook takes g3 with check, and the bishop on d3 is hanging. Even if you insert a move g takes h7, capturing another pawn, the king goes away, and the bishop on d3 is hanging. You cannot trade off queens, like I mentioned already. Well, if you do keep the bishop on the board, hitting the knight on h5, the key move here is to play the move queen to h4. And now after bishop takes h5, you can take the rook on e1. You do have a rook versus 2 minor pieces, but it's an incredibly sharp position, and apparently after exchanging rooks, for instance, in king h2, the queen goes to h4, and well, it's not clear why this would be better for white at all. But you see, this is a line of more than 10 moves deep. It's understandable that black was not up to the task to work out all the consequences of this move. So let's see what happened in the game. There followed rook takes e6. Now f5 is played, and you understand that this knight on f8 is not able to join the attack against the white king. Black decided now to take on f5. There is rook takes f5, hitting the knight on h5. The knight goes back, but also the rook goes now back to f3 because it's under threat, so rook f3 is absolutely fine. Rook a e8, black is bringing the remaining piece into the game, but white does the same. The queen comes to f2, and I really like the coordination, the harmony between white's pieces. Everything is nicely defended. You do have a half open f-file, which can be used by the major pieces. The bishop is also a great piece. And I think black is going to suffer now because the g-pawn is no longer there. So the king side is very vulnerable. Black decided here to put the knight on g6. And how should white try to make progress here? Well, I was very impressed by the move played by Fabiano Caruana as he went for the move g4. It's absolutely justified to bring up the g-pawn. It's not a weakening of your own king's position because the king is absolutely safe, being surrounded by the other pieces. And, well, black is struggling to find good squares for basically all the pieces. The knights, they don't have any nice prospects. Also, the rook on e6 is not able to exert any pressure here. And, well, for instance, a waiting move like rook e7 even runs into bishop f5. This is a very cool idea I wanted to show you, as it just traps the rook. You're hitting the rook on e6. If you take with a knight on f5, there's g takes f5. It's a double attack. You're dropping a piece. So black, running out of useful moves here, decided to go back with a knight to h8. Remarkable idea. White played the move h4. The knight went to f7. But now white continues with the move g5. Very cool idea, adding more pressure to the pawn on f6. You cannot take on g5 because then the knight on f7 will be taken. Oparin tried here to keep the position closed with the move f5, and I think it's a good practical decision. But Fabi is very, very sharp at this point. He doesn't want to take the pawn on f5. He can take a pawn for free. Bishop takes f5, but after knight takes, rook takes, I mean, you're giving back some part of your advantage. This is not that simple. You're a pawn up, but black is very solid and quite relieved, having traded off that very poor knight for white's great bishop. Instead of taking the pawn on f5, look what Caruana did here. He went for the move knight e2. That knight on c3 was not doing anything, and now after queen to d7, the knight goes to f4, hits the rook on e6, the rook goes back, and now various interesting ideas, but I really like Fabiano's play here as he goes for the move g6. He hits the knight, hits the pawn on h7, and that means that the g file will be opened soon. H takes g6 was played. Now the knight does take back. It hits the rook on e7. The rook goes to e6, and now white is shifting the attention to the g file. You're not interested in that pawn on f5 yet, but you do play the move queen to g2. And you can see that if you do give white a couple of moves, let's say the rook comes to g3, you move the king away, the other rook comes over to the g file, then you have tremendous pressure against that black king, against the knight on g7. Now, here in the game, black played the move knight to d6. I wanted to show you one other cool tactic, as king h7 looks like a very natural move to hit the knight on g6. But then I'm pretty sure that white's intention had been to take with the rook on f5. Fantastic idea. You're sacrificing the exchange. After knight takes f5, bishop takes f5, you do pin the rook on e6, so the rook can't move. But more importantly, you're setting up new threats against the black king, because the main idea is to move the knight to f8 with a discovered check. You're winning the queen. If you go for king h6, now you're able to take on e6, win back some of your investment. But much stronger here is this beautiful idea of knight e5, attacking the queen, attacking the knight on f7. And the knight on f7 is a very important defender, because if it does take the knight on e5, now the g5 square is no longer defended and it's checkmate. This is the attack Fabiano Caruana had been playing for. Beautiful way of building up the pressure against the king. You understand now why king h7 was not played. Knight d6 looks like a nice idea to consolidate the position, to defend the pawn on f5 one more time. But after knight e5, the knight hits the queen, and the queen goes to e7, and now you can simply take on f5. You're taking a very important pawn. The position gets more open and open. Knight takes f5, rook takes f5, the knight on g7 is pinned, not allowed to take the rook. So black takes the pawn on h4. Material, it's still even, but even though your rook is under threat, now thanks to the move rook ef1, white is just further increasing the tension with a possible move like rook f7. You're about to deliver checkmate. So you can see that white's king is much safer, and that's because of the superior placement of the major pieces. Black played here the move queen e4, aiming for the exchange of queens, and white should keep the queen on the g-file to make sure that the knight on g7 is still pinned. So queen g5, that's a great attacking idea. And well, there are still plans of, for instance, playing rook f7 very soon. But here, rook h6 was played. So you see, black is looking for the opportunity to enter with the rook on h1, or maybe even with the queen sometimes. Anyway, the rook on h6 can just be taken. Queen takes h6. The idea is now that the queen is no longer on the g-file, so knight takes f5, hitting the queen. And black is even threatening to take on e3 with his own queen. So you got to think about how to do something about it. Well, a logical move seems to be queen g6. Was not played in the game, and rightly so, because it does give black the chance to play knight g7 to keep the rook defended. And once again, you do offer the exchange of queens. Much stronger is the move queen g5 check, when you also hit the knight on f5. So the only move here is knight to g7. And now Fabi played this brilliant move, knight to g4, which threatens a huge knight fork on f6, forking the king, rook, and queen. The knight also protects the pawn on e3, so no check available here for black. Only move is rook e6, but the knight comes in to f6 anyway. Black is now forced to give up the exchange. Rook takes f6, rook takes f6, queen to b1, check. But this position is just completely lost. White is an exchange up, and black can still take a pawn on b2. But this king is just wide open. Queen e7 is just a very nice move. Black also centralizes his own queen, but then the rook comes in to f8. That was the idea of placing the queen there. King h7, queen to h4. And obviously, if you do play here king g6, that allows rook f6 with checkmate. So instead, after queen to h4, knight h5 was played. The alternative is, of course, to interfere with the queen, but exchanging queens is just completely hopeless. So knight h5 on the board. And now the rook comes back to f2, trying to deflect the queen from the support of the knight. Queen takes e3 is met by queen takes h5. So black's only move here is queen d1. But then the king goes to h2. King g6 played. And here, after queen h3, Oparin had seen enough. White has just various ideas to infiltrate with the queen, either on e6 or f5, maybe rook g2. Let me show you a few lines. For instance, knight f6 runs into queen f5 check. And on the next move, you can take the knight on f6. So that doesn't work. Also, knight g7 can just be met by rook g2. That's a convincing move, as after king f7, queen d7, you're picking up the knight. And one other line I just briefly checked is, for instance, queen d3 to try to cover some squares, but after queen g4, check, king h6, you put a rook on g2, threatening queen g5 when you are forced as black to give up the protection of the knight on h5, while after queen takes e3 to defend the g5 square, there is queen g6 with checkmate. I mean, this is not a forcing line, but it just shows you that the rook and queen, they are just way too strong for the queen and knight. Fantastic game with an accuracy of 98.1% by Fabiano Caruana in an over-the-board game. I thought that was very impressive. Let me know in the comments, what do you think of this game? Is this a real sign that Fabiano Caruana is in great shape? Is he going to win the American Cup, which he managed to win in 2022? We will see in about 1 week from now. We know more what's going to happen in this event. And of course, I'll keep you posted. So if you do like this video, make sure to subscribe to the channel and you will see more action from the American Cup.